Hello, and welcome back to World Civilization 2. This is the history of the world from 1500 to the present, and we are on chapter 31, and we are talking about how the Industrial Revolution began in England. And this is the early Industrial Revolution, and we're on about page 423. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and put me in the corner and try to move around here. It's hard to make me smaller. Probably need to be a little smaller. Anyway, here is the map on page 423, and it talks about the Britain's Industrial Revolution. Something you do need to understand about the about England's Industrial Revolution is that a lot of companies were moving other places, and there was a big deal about keeping secrets and not allowing others to have information to be catapulted into the Industrial Revolution. Okay, so the spread of it. Okay, we want to talk more about Isambard Kingdom Brunel, who was from French immigrants, but he moved to I believe it was London. He was both an engineer and an owner in the railroads. So let's see if we can picture. There he is. He was an industrial leader in industrialism, and he did a lot of invention. He did the lampposts at London's Paddington Station. He also did a lot of he did some bridge construction, railroad bridge construction and design, and he also did some railroad, the ties, the track, he designed some of that as well. So really interesting. He's like a famous person in England for his railroad contribution. It was steam powered, and really cut down on the cost of shipping when the railroad came about. And I talked about in the last part one about canals and how canals were very popular in Ohio. The canal system really helped with transportation and getting goods to market as well. Okay. Spread of the Industrial Revolution. It spread slowly at first, and we did talk about how China was on the verge of it, and then because their population went through the roof, because China, if you study Chinese history, first of all, it's fascinating and fantastic. And secondly, they were about 800 years ahead of Europeans, which is just mind-blowing and mind-boggling. Okay, so slow at first. England tried to keep the secrets. We just talked about that. Knowledge spread to the US and Europe. Cotton began to industrialize. Belgium, northern France. Where there weren't free peasants and it was still in serfdom, and it was still kind of like the Middle Ages and little kingdoms and serfdoms, they couldn't really have an industrial revolution because you have to understand, because the serfs could not leave their manors. It was illegal. And so the freedom of these workers, these peasants, needed to happen prior. And that's what this next slide is really cool, showing that. You can see no peasant emancipation in the lavender areas, and then manufacturing industry and industrial in the blue areas, coal mining, iron industry, textiles, and silk industry. All right, we talked about the railroads. Liverpool to Manchester in 1830. Most countries had lines by 1840, as many private railroads went bankrupt and were taken over by the government, except in the US. Powered by simple steam locomotives, and that technology really didn't change for 100 years, which was extremely interesting. Okay, let's keep going. The spread of the Industrial Revolution. Okay, and what was really cool is that there were three Industrial Revolution, kind of the pre or the first Industrial Revolution, which they're saying is from 1760 to 1820. The second one is where Germany takes over and gets ahead of Great Britain. And if you know anything about history, it's just the most marvelous thing. This was the 500-year anniversary last October, of Martin Luther nailing 95 Theses on the church door. But what that spurred is an educational movement. And whenever you pour education into the country, it lifts the whole country. And you can see the technology, the economics shooting through the roof, because Germany, which would have been Prussia and Austria at this time, was really trying to have government schooling and education to teach people how to read, because Martin Luther said everyone needs to know how to read so they can read the Bible. But that education is never wasted. All right. And of course, I'm a proponent of education in any way, shape, or form raises the whole country. Okay. So the third industrial revolution, I don't know if you read this, but that's what we're in right now. It's symbolized and powered by the computer. Wow. Okay, 1750 to 1850, they talk about normal parental love. There were a lot of things keeping parents from loving their children, and most of it was very tragic because kids did not live very long. So being attached to a child was very scary for parents because they lost so many. I can't even imagine the pain of such. So they would be very careful not to get too attached until they knew that they had a better chance of living. They had large families that lived under one roof. Sometimes 5 and 6 people slept in the same bed. I don't know if you read that as well. Stereotype family. Some things before the Industrial Revolution. A lowering of the average marrying age. It was 27 for both men and women, and it lowers to 22. 23.5 for men, 22 for women. Lots of kids were being born out of wedlock. And there was a low number of elderly. People weren't living as long. So there were diseases, especially for children, dying. And, we talked even later in the Industrial Revolution, just public health was still horrible. It was awful. Talked about German and Prussia, really Germany, which was then Prussia. Just education was through the roof, and that's why their technology was so amazing. All right. It talks about how things began to change. There began to be less child death and a greater middle class where you didn't have to work. Both parents didn't always have to work, and someone could stay home and nurture the children. Because before, really, the parenting and kind of treating children like we think of today was only for the nobility and the wealthy. All right, because everyone else, another mouth to feed. Was it extreme stress or not a good thing? And as education came along, it also helped kind of shift the tide. Right. Female occupation. In the Industrial Revolution, we talked about this at the beginning, the female occupations were really limited. Unless you were a working class woman or lower class woman, you had way less rights, way less mobility, way less freedom than you did before the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution set up these social constructs of how a woman's supposed to be and act and her fit in society, and it was a box that she could not get out of. All right, urban migration to the cities. Why did people do it? Out of curiosity, desire to improve their economic and social status. There was opportunities, desire to find better marital partners. You also have to understand, firstborn sons were very lucky. They got all the property, but the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth, 10th son was either going to be trained in a trade or, possibly that was an appeal to go to the city as well. The 1851 census in England was the first time cities had more people than the rural areas. Okay, so you have the nobility, you have some class systems here, you have some social classes. The nobility you have at the top, they're self-governing, they're the aristocrats, and the wealthy married the wealthy, and they were the bankers and the merchants, and they governed the cities. And then you have the middle class coming up, the urban upper middle class, well-educated, upward and mobile, the bourgeoisie, and then you have a lower middle class as well, and then you have the lower working class. Public health was not good at all. One of the biggest problems, again, we see greedy capitalism. Someone wanted to take advantage of people. So they build tiny, tiny little apartments with no ventilation, tenement housing, and the air is so bad and so disgusting that people begin getting tuberculosis, which is called consumption. Sometimes if someone says that, if you read in history someone's died of consumption, it's a tuberculosis. And these cheap rental houses were just awful. And this is where you see people, 5 to 6 people in a bed, and just people needed to live somewhere in order to work in the factories, but it was awful. Tenement housing was also a huge problem in the U.S. and just an infestation of germs and diseases. There's a huge living standard gap between the rich and the poor. These very wealthy people, wealthy nobility and wealthy elite, which is one of your words, would have 14-course meals. And then you have the modest urban middle class that was much more modest living. And then, of course, the lower classes lived in these horrific places, and there were cholera outbreaks and tuberculosis outbreaks and that sort of thing. There were some reforms and improvements on child labor, but it wasn't great. 13-year-olds only could work 12 hours, and 9-year-olds could work 8 hours. Still in England, you have this where kids are not being educated, they're being worked still. Now, they cut back so that they could be educated, but and some compulsory education coming about. But Germany really was the leader in that. And that is one reason their technology was through the roof in World War I. Their technology and their schools and their colleges just boomed. So whenever you pour education into any country, it's going to lift everyone. Okay, women and children terribly exploited, just paid just pennies on the dollar of men and worked just as hard, if not harder. Sanitation was still a huge problem in public health. Okay, so you have your key terms at the end. I would encourage you to look them up. Factory Acts, factory system, first industrial revolution, putting out system, second industrial revolution, and urban migration. All right, and thank you very much, and have a lovely day.